The wind was a cruel whisper that night. It snuck through the cracks in the buildings, curling itself around the little girl's thin frame like a serpent made of ice. She pulled her knees to her chest and buried her face in the oversized hoodie she had found in a dumpster days ago. It still smelled like old coffee and mold, but it was the only thing keeping the cold from biting her skin raw. Her name was Layla, or at least that's what she remembered being called before the shouting matches, before the broken plates, before the door slammed shut for the last time and never opened again. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. People passed by her without a glance. The city never slept, but it also never noticed. Lights flickered above her head, street lamps casting orange halos on the cracked pavement, while car engines and distant music hummed like a lullaby for someone else's child, not hers. A drop of rain landed on her cheek, then another. Soon, the drizzle turned into a downpour, soaking the cardboard she had curled beneath. She shivered, her teeth clacking together in a steady rhythm of despair. She wasn't crying. She had stopped doing that. Crying didn't change anything. The rain had stopped, but Layla hadn't moved. She sat in the mud, her arms wrapped around Dusty's lifeless body. Her hoodie, soaked through, clung to her small frame, now trembling with a quiet, unshakable cold. Her eyes, wide and glassy, stared into nothing, into the place where he should still be. Time didn't feel real. Minutes stretched like hours. Her heartbeat was slow, as if her body had forgotten how to keep going. People passed. Some glanced. None stopped. Eventually, the weight of Dusty's body began to slip from her arms. Her fingers, stiff and cramping, tried to hold on. She didn't want to let go. She couldn't. But something inside her whispered, "You have to move, not for safety, not for comfort, just survival." With her last ounce of strength, Layla laid Dusty on a patch of dry earth beneath the eave of a ruined building. She found a piece of cardboard and covered him gently, her hands shaking. She whispered one word before standing up. "Sorry." She walked. Her legs moved like she was underwater, slow and uncertain. She didn't know where she was going. Her thoughts were fog, her emotions like smoke after a fire burnt out, but still lingering. That night, she found shelter beneath a collapsed bridge, huddled against a wall slick with algae. Her stomach cramped from hunger, but the pain barely registered. She closed her eyes and saw Dusty chasing the wind, nose pressed against her cheek. Sleep didn't come, but something else did. A rustle. Layla flinched and sat up, heart thudding, footsteps soft, hesitant, then a voice, barely above a whisper. "Are you alone?" From the darkness emerged a boy, maybe a year or two older than her. He had wild hair, a cut across his brow, and eyes that darted like he was ready to run. Layla said nothing. "I saw what happened," the boy said. "With the dog," her fists clenched. "I'm sorry," he added quickly. "I wasn't close enough to help." Still, she said nothing. The boy stepped closer. "Name's Kai." Layla looked away. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with unspoken things. "I got food," he said finally. "Not much, but it's real." He knelt down and pulled a crumpled paper bag from his coat. Inside was half a sandwich, peanut butter, maybe, and a bruised apple. Layla stared. He set it beside her without pushing. "I don't take stuff for free," she muttered. Kai tilted his head. "Then don't call it a trade. You talk, I share." She looked at the food again, then back at him. Minutes passed. "Layla," she said finally. He smiled. It was small and uneven, but real. The sandwich tasted like heaven. They didn't talk much that night. They just sat side by side in the dark, backs against the same wall. At one point, she dozed off. When she woke, Kai was still there, arms crossed, head tilted down, breathing slow. It was the first time since Dusty that she didn't feel completely alone. The next day, they moved together. Kai knew the city better than she did. He showed her which bins had leftovers early in the morning, which shopkeepers didn't chase kids away, where to sleep when it rained hard. He didn't talk about himself much, and she didn't ask. But slowly, they built a rhythm. Two shadows against the concrete, sharing warmth, silence, and scars neither of them dared name. That afternoon, while resting near a bus station, they heard a rustle in the bushes nearby. Layla tensed. Kai stood, alert. A figure emerged, a girl, barefoot and thin, no older than Layla. Her eyes were wide, cheeks hollow. She clutched a baby doll in one hand, the other dragging a ripped backpack. Kai stepped forward. "You lost?" The girl didn't answer. Instead, she dropped the bag and collapsed to her knees. Layla rushed over. Hey, are you okay?" The girl was shivering, barely able to speak. "No home, no food. They left me." Tears spilled from her eyes. Layla wrapped an arm around her. "It's okay. You're safe now." Kai handed her a bottle of water. As the girl drank, Layla looked up at Kai. "What now?" He hesitated. Then he said, "We don't leave her." And just like that, there were three forgotten children, bound not by blood, but by survival. The streets were still cold, still dangerous. But now, they weren't alone. Morning crept in through cracks in the clouds, painting the sky a pale gray that never quite became light. The city stirred with groaning buses, distant sirens, and footsteps that never stopped. But under the rusted overhang behind the bus station, 3 children sat in quiet stillness, still strangers, but no longer alone. The girl with the doll hadn't said much. She clutched the tattered thing like it was life itself, her fingers locked around its plastic hand. Its face was scratched, one eye permanently closed, but she cradled it gently, like it was a sister. Layla watched her, uncertain. Kai sat nearby, chewing on the edge of a cracker he'd swiped from a vending machine the night before. His eyes flicked between the streets and the girls, always watching, always thinking ahead. "What's your name?" Layla asked gently. The girl didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the ground. "It's okay," Layla said, softer. "We won't hurt you, promise." A beat, then another. Finally, the girl whispered, "Mira." Layla smiled. "That's pretty." Mira didn't respond. Her arms tightened around the doll. "Is she your sister?" Kai asked, nodding toward the doll. "No," Mira said, "but she listens." That made Layla's heart tighten in a way she didn't expect. She remembered talking to Dusty like that, like he understood everything. Kai didn't push further. Instead, he stood and stretched, his joints popping. "We need food," Layla nodded. Her stomach agreed. She turned to Mira. "You coming?" Mira hesitated, then stood. She kept the doll in one arm and her backpack close to her side. Together, the 3 slipped into the city's vein. It took hours to find anything. The bakery Kai had counted on was closed. The back of the supermarket had already been raided by older kids who threw rocks when they got too close. A kind-looking woman at a food cart offered Layla a leftover pastry until her boss yelled and pulled her away. By mid-afternoon, they were starving. Then Kai had an idea. "There's this guy," he said, leading them through a series of narrow alleys. "He works behind the soup kitchen, doesn't ask questions, sometimes gives scraps." Layla didn't question it. She just followed. But when they reached the back of the soup kitchen, the door was shut. A handwritten sign taped to the wall read, "Closed for repairs." Kai punched the wall. Damn it! They slumped onto the ground beside a dumpster. Mira curled up beside Layla, the doll resting on her lap. Her lips were pale. "We can try again tomorrow," Layla offered, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. Then Mira spoke quietly, but with clarity. "There's a house." Kai blinked. "What?" "I ran from there," Mira said, "before I found you. A big house. Empty. I used to watch it through the trees. Sometimes I slept by the fence." Layla leaned forward. "Where is it?" "Near the old train yard," Mira whispered. "It looks broken, but it's not. It has blankets and sometimes food." Kai's eyes narrowed. "You sure?" Mira nodded. "Then let's go." The sun dipped low as they crossed through forgotten parts of the city where buildings leaned like trunks and streets cracked like old skin. When they reached the train yard, the rails were rusted and weeds grew wild between them. Everything was quiet except for the wind brushing against broken glass. Mira led them past a chain-link fence through a hole torn near the bottom. And there it was. A house. Not a mansion, not a hut, just a house. 2 stories, wood panels peeling, one window shattered. But Mira had been right. It wasn't dead. There were signs of life. Layla's heart pounded. They crept inside. The air smelled like dust and old wood, but it wasn't damp or cold. There was an old mattress in the corner, blankets piled in a heap, A half-full can of beans sat on the floor, left behind. Someone's been here, Kai said, his voice low. But they're not now, Layla replied. They looked around. No footstep, no sound. Maybe they'll come back, Mira murmured. Maybe, Kai said, but not tonight. They made camp. Mira curled up on the mattress with her doll. Kai leaned against the wall, keeping watch. Layla sat at the window, staring out at the dying light. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, they had warmth, shelter, each other. She whispered Dusty's name into the shadows, and for the first time since losing him, she didn't feel like it echoed back alone. The next morning brought silence. Not peace, just a stillness too heavy to be comfortable. The kind that made your skin prickle like something unseen was watching. The house hadn't crumbled overnight, but something about the way it held its breath made Layla uneasy. She woke before the others, a soft gray light filtering through the boarded windows. Mira was still curled on the mattress, clutching her doll. Kai had dozed off near the door, arms crossed, a stick in his lap like a makeshift weapon. Layla stood and moved slowly through the hallway. The floors groaned beneath her bare feet. She paused at every creak, listening. Nothing. No voices. No footsteps. Just dust in the air and the distant sound of trains that no longer ran. In the kitchen, she found a drawer full of old spoons, a rusted can opener, and a broken radio. Everything smelled like mothballs and time, but no signs of who had left the blankets and food. Maybe they're just gone, she whispered to herself. She wanted to believe that. They spent the morning cleaning. Kai found a broom missing half its bristles and started sweeping dust into corners. Layla used an old rag to wipe down windows. Mira, quiet and focused, folded the blankets neatly and arranged her doll in the center, like it belonged there. It was the first time in a long while that any of them felt something like purpose. We could stay here, Layla said as they gathered near the window for a can of beans, split 3 ways. Kai frowned. For now, but we don't know who this place belongs to. They haven't come back, Mira said softly. And I stayed here once for 2 nights. No one came. Kai didn't argue further, but he didn't look convinced either. That afternoon, while Mira napped and Kai worked to block the broken window with a shelf, Layla stepped onto the porch. The air was warmer than usual. Birds chirped in the distance. For a moment, the city didn't feel so cruel. She sat on the top step, watching weeds sway along the sidewalk. Then she heard it crunch. A footstep, not Kai's, not Mira's. She froze. From behind the bushes near the fence, someone stepped out. A boy, maybe 13 or 14, tall, lanky, with a bandage wrapped around one hand and a cigarette tucked behind his ear. He looked straight at her. You're new, he said, voice flat. Layla stood slowly. Who are you? He didn't answer immediately, just stared, then nodded at the house. That place was empty last week. Now it's not. We're not bothering anyone, she said quickly. We're just sleeping. He stepped closer, not threatening, but confident, like he didn't fear anything. You're brave, he said. Most kids don't stay here long. Why? The boy pointed to the sky with his thumb. Because someone always comes back, and not the kind that shares. Layla's heart dropped. He studied her face. I'm Jace. I've been watching this spot for a while. Never saw you before. She didn't respond. She didn't trust him yet. I'm not here to steal, he added, but I figured you should know. If the old guy who squatted here shows up, he won't like company. Layla swallowed hard. What kind of guy? Jace shrugged. Mean, quiet, carries a crowbar. Heard he used to work at the yard before they shut it down. A crowbar. Layla's mind flashed Dusty, the stranger in the dark. You ever seen him hurt anyone? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jace's eyes narrowed. Once. A dog. Why? She couldn't breathe. She nodded slowly. Thanks for the warning. Jace started to turn away, then paused. You're tougher than you look. She didn't answer. He disappeared into the weeds. Layla stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the spot where he'd been. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were dry. She went back inside. Kai looked up when she entered. Everything okay? She nodded, lying. Just the wind but she sat down, close to Mira, close to the doll, and for the rest of the evening, she didn't speak. Not because she was afraid, because now she knew what was coming, and she was done running. Night returned heavier than before. The house, once a fragile sanctuary, now felt like a trap waiting to spring. Shadows clung to corners, and every creak in the wood sounded like a warning. The air had changed. Even Mira, usually quiet and distant, clung tighter to her doll. She hadn't asked questions, but she could sense something in Layla's silence. Kai noticed too. "You saw someone," he said once Mira had dozed off. Layla sat cross-legged on the mattress, arms around her knees. "Yeah, who?" She didn't look at him. "A boy, Jace. He said this house. Someone else used to live here." Kai frowned. "Someone dangerous?" She nodded. He leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "We should go." Layla's head snapped up. "No." Kai blinked. "What?" "I'm tired of running." Her voice was low but steady. "This place, it gave us something. A moment. Shelter. Food." Mira's sleeping without flinching. "I'm not giving that up." Kai stared at her, then slowly lowered his gaze. "He hurt a dog," Layla added. "That made him freeze." "The same guy?" "I think so." A long silence passed between them. Then Kai said, "Okay, we stay, but we prepare." The next morning, they searched the house. In the garage, behind cracked drywall and old paint cans, Kai found a rusted metal pipe and a dented shovel. Layla took a screwdriver from a forgotten toolbox. They weren't weapons, but they were something. Mira found a pile of old batteries in a drawer. She didn't say much, just lined them up beside the doll like a silent offering. They spent the day reinforcing the house. Blankets were used to block light from windows. Broken furniture was stacked near the doors, just enough to slow someone down. Kai rigged a string of soda cans across the hallway, a warning system, he called it. That night, they didn't sleep. They took shifts, Layla and Kai switching spots every few hours. Mira stayed curled on the mattress, her doll in her arms, as if the weight of it kept her grounded. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, hearts beat in unison, quiet but ready. It happened just before dawn. Layla was by the window when she saw movement across the yard. A figure, slow and deliberate, walked through the weeds. Tall, heavy coat, a limp in his left leg. In one hand, something long and iron. A crowbar. Her breath caught. She crawled to Kai, shaking his shoulder. He woke instantly. One look at her face, and he was up, grabbing the pipe. "Get Mira," he whispered. Layla rushed to the mattress. "Mira, wake up," she said urgently. Now, Mira stirred, confused. "No time. We need to hide." They moved quickly, silent. Mira clutched her doll and followed Layla to the closet near the stairs. Kai crouched by the door, hidden in shadow. Then the front doorknob twisted. Layla pulled Mira close, heart pounding so loud she was sure it could be heard. The door didn't open. Instead, a loud thud, the sound of the crowbar striking wood. Another, then another. Kai braced himself. The door cracked open. A boot stepped inside. Dust swirled around the man's legs as he pushed further into the house. He said nothing. The crowbar scraped against the floor. His breath was raspy, labored, like the wind carried illness with it. Layla shut her eyes. Mira whimpered once, and Layla clamped a hand over her mouth. The man stopped. Then a crash. The soda cans. He turned. Kai struck. The pipe hit the man's arm. He roared in pain and swung wildly. Kai ducked, the crowbar smashing into the wall. Layla watched, frozen, as Kai shoved the man back. He wasn't strong enough to stop him, but he was fast. The second swing missed. The third caught Kai in the side, sending him to the floor with a grunt. "No!" Layla screamed, bursting from the closet. The man turned, eyes wide, just as Layla drove the screwdriver into his leg. He howled, stumbling back, dropping the crowbar. Kai kicked it away and dragged himself upright. The man, now gasping, bleeding, stumbled toward the door and fled into the early dawn. Gone. Minutes passed before anyone moved. Layla sat beside Kai, her hands shaking as she held pressure against his bleeding side. Mira knelt beside them, her doll pressed to her chest, eyes wide. "You okay?" Layla whispered. Kai nodded weakly. He's gone, and for the first time since entering the house, it truly felt like theirs. Not borrowed, not stolen, claimed. Morning light crept through the cracks like a timid visitor, unsure if it was welcome. The house was a wreck, broken furniture, blood smeared on the floor, shattered glass near the door. But it still stood, and they were still inside it, alive. Kai lay on the mattress now, shirt lifted to expose the bruise spreading across his ribs. The bleeding had slowed, but his breaths came shallow and quick. Layla knelt beside him with a damp cloth, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You need a doctor," she said. Kai shook his head. "No hospitals. I wasn't talking about hospitals." Still, he gave her that stubborn look, the one that said, "We don't belong in their world." Mira sat by the window, doll in her lap, chewing at the edge of her sleeve. She hadn't spoken since the attack. Her wide eyes kept drifting toward the broken door. Layla stood and moved to her. "You okay?" Mira nodded, then whispered, "He looked like the man from my old place." Layla sat beside her. "He won't come back, but if he does." Layla thought for a moment. "Then we stop him again." They sat in silence after that. The air was thick with fear and fatigue. Later that day, they buried the crowbar, not out of fear, out of choice. Kai had dragged himself out to the backyard despite Layla's protests. He said if they left it around, it would be like inviting violence back in. So they dug a shallow grave behind the shed, wrapped the weapon in a cloth, and laid it to rest beneath the earth. It was Mira who pressed a single stone on top, whispering something too soft for anyone to hear. As they walked back toward the house, Layla glanced at her. "Why did you do that?" Mira looked up. "So it stays buried." That night, Layla couldn't sleep. She sat by the front window with a blanket around her shoulders, watching the yard. The world outside moved on, uncaring. Somewhere, people were laughing, eating, sleeping in beds. She didn't hate them for it, but she envied it deeply. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the collar Dusty had worn, a scrap of red nylon she'd never thrown away. She turned it over in her hands, then tied it around her wrist. A quiet reminder. Behind her, Kai stirred. "You okay?" She nodded. "Just thinking." He sat up with a wince. "That guy, he's not done." Layla met his eyes. "Neither are we." Kai smiled, tired but proud. "We make a good team." "Yeah," Layla whispered. "We do." The next few days brought quiet. They fixed the door with planks of wood scavenged from a nearby construction site. Mira found old batteries and made a lamp flicker for the first time. Kai, moving slower now, taught them how to siphon clean water from the pipe behind a gas station. It was survival, but it felt different now. Like maybe, just maybe, they could build something from the ashes. Not a life anyone else would understand, but theirs. One morning, Layla heard something unusual outside. Voices. Young one. She peeked through the boarded window. 2 boys and a girl, maybe 10, maybe younger, stood by the fence, backpacks on their shoulders, shoes worn down to threads. One of them pointed at the house. Layla stepped out onto the porch. They froze. "Hey," she said. "You looking for somewhere safe?" The tallest boy nodded, cautious. Layla stepped aside. "Come in. But you work, you share, and you don't steal." The girl smiled first. Then they came inside. That night, 6 children sat around the dim glow of a makeshift lantern, passing a tin of beans, laughing at Mira's quiet jokes, listening to Kai's stories of the train yard ghosts. Layla sat with her back against the wall, watching them all. Her family, not the one she was born into, the one she chose. And for the first time since she'd been abandoned, she didn't feel forgotten. The house had a new heartbeat. What once echoed with emptiness now pulsed with quiet voices, laughter, the shuffle of feet on dusty floors. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was alive. A stitched-together family of survivors, broken in different places, mending slowly under the same roof. Layla stood in the center of the living room, watching as the younger kids helped Mira light the lamp. The girl who once clutched silence like a shield now showed others how to twist wires, how to make old batteries breathe life again. Kai rested in the corner, pipe across his knees like a silent warning. His bruises had faded to yellow-green, but the pain still made him limp. He didn't complain. He just watched, like a silent guardian. Layla turned toward the hallway where the new kids had made their sleeping spots. They came from different streets, different stories, but carried the same weight in their eyes. The kind you don't get from schoolyard games or scraped knees. The kind born from nights with empty stomachs and no hands to hold. She knew it too well. That evening, after a shared meal of canned beans and stale crackers, they all gathered in the living room. Kai poked at a tiny fire in the old fireplace. They'd found enough scraps to make it work, and its flickering light made the room feel warmer than any blanket could. Layla sat close, her knees drawn up, Dusty's collar still wrapped around her wrist. Mira rested her head on Layla's shoulder, her doll nestled between them. The youngest boy, Eli, no older than 7, held up a crayon drawing. "It's us," he said proudly. "We're a team." The picture was jagged and messy, lines crossing in every direction, but it showed 7 stick figures standing in front of a crooked house, smoke curling from a chimney. Layla smiled. "That's beautiful, Eli," he beamed. Then one of the new girls, Juno, asked, "What happens if someone comes again?" The room quieted. Everyone looked at Layla. She didn't answer. Right away, she stood, walked to the window, and peered out at the dark. Then she said, "Then we stand together." It wasn't brave talk. It was a promise. Later, when the little ones had gone to sleep and the fire had turned to glowing embers, Kai joined Layla on the porch. They listened to the night, sounds crickets, distant dogs, the hum of the broken city. "You're changing," he said. Layla raised an eyebrow. "Is that a good thing?" Kai chuckled. "You were scared, quiet, angry. I'm still angry," she said without shame. "Yeah," Kai nodded. "But now you're something else too." She glanced at him. "What?" He thought for a moment. "A leader." She looked down at her wrist, at the worn red collar. "I don't want to lead. You already are." Before they went back inside, they heard something. Footsteps, but not like before. Lighter, faster. From the darkness emerged a girl alone, breathing hard, her clothes torn at the edges. She froze when she saw them. "Please," she said, "don't send me away." Layla stepped forward slowly. "You hungry?" The girl nodded. "Then come in." No hesitation this time. They gave her food, a blanket, corner of the room. Her name was Suri. She didn't say where she came from, but her eyes said enough. Eyes that had seen too much. Eyes that were used to doors closing. Layla made sure theirs stayed open. That night, as the fire dimmed, Layla wrote something in the dust beside the fireplace with her finger. "We are not lost." Then she lay down beside Mira, closed her eyes, and dreamed not of the past, but of what might still come. And in her sleep, she smiled. The rain came fast. One moment, the city was quiet. The next, it was drowning in sound, raindrops pelting rooftops, gutters overflowing, wind howling like a wild thing let loose. Inside the house, water slid down the window panes in steady streams, and thunder cracked like angry gods in the sky. Layla stood at the front door, staring out at the chaos. She'd always hated storms, not just for the noise, but for what they brought: cold, fear, the return of memories best left buried. Behind her, the others worked quickly. Mira and Juno moved blankets away from the leaking walls. Kai and Eli tried to catch the worst of the drips in old buckets and pans. Suri knew, but already part of the rhythm boarded up the back door with scrap wood. Despite the noise, there was a strange sense of control, a kind of teamwork that made Layla's chest ache in a good way. Then they heard it, a scream, not from the house, from outside. Layla and Kai locked eyes. Another scream closer, sharper, a girl's voice, full of panic. Kai grabbed the pipe. Layla didn't need to speak, she was already moving. They found her in the alley, 2 blocks away. A girl, maybe 12, soaked to the bone, cornered by 2 older boys with ratty coats and hungry eyes. One had a switchblade, the other was laughing. Layla didn't think, she just moved. "Hey," she shouted. The boys turned. "What's this?" One of them sneered. "Hero time?" Kai stepped forward, pipe in hand. "Leave her," the taller boy pointed the knife. "Or what?" Kai didn't flinch. "Or you bleed before we do." The storm raged around them, wind whipping their clothes, rain blinding their vision. But the moment stretched tight and breathless. The boy with the knife stepped forward. Then Layla picked up a broken bottle from the ground and held it out like fire. "Try me," she said. It wasn't the threat that scared them. It was the look in her eyes. The boys backed off slowly, muttering curses. Then they disappeared into the rain. Layla dropped the bottle the second they were gone. Her hands were shaking. Kai ran to the girl. She was crying, her knees scraped, her lip bleeding. "We've got you," he said gently. Layla knelt beside them. "What's your name?" The girl sniffled. "Talia. You're safe now, Talia." Back at the house, they dried her off, wrapped her in blankets. Mira brought her half a granola bar she'd saved. Suri gave her the dry socks she'd claimed 2 days ago. They sat around the fire again that night, quiet. Talia spoke first. "Why did you help me?" Layla looked at her. "Because someone has to," Kai added. "Because we've all been you." Talia looked around. "Can I stay?" Layla didn't hesitate. "Yes, later." As the others slept, Layla sat on the porch again, rain still drizzling gently now. The storm was moving on, but its echoes stayed behind. Kai sat beside her. "You didn't even think twice." "Neither did you." He smiled. "We're starting to matter, you know." Layla looked at him. "We always mattered. We're just finally realizing it." They sat in silence, watching the clouds drift. The city was still broken, but piece by piece, they were building something stronger than anything the storm could tear down. Something that even the streets couldn't swallow. It was almost morning when he appeared. A man tall, thin, wrapped in a heavy coat despite the warming air. He stood at the edge of the street, just beyond the broken fence, half hidden in shadow. He didn't move, didn't speak. Layla saw him first, from her usual spot on the porch. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, but he was still there, watching. She didn't panic, not yet. She stepped back inside and nudged Kai awake. "There's someone outside." Kai sat up instantly. "Who?" "I don't know. He's just standing there." Kai grabbed the pipe. Layla took the screwdriver from beneath her pillow. They moved to the window together. The man hadn't moved. His face was still hidden by shadow, but something about him made Layla's skin crawl. Not just fear, something deeper, like recognition she didn't want to feel. "We should wake the others," she said quietly. Kai nodded. They gathered in the living room. 7 kids, half awake, gripping makeshift weapons or each other's hands. Talia clung to Mira. Eli sat with wide eyes and a trembling lip. "Did he say anything?" Suri asked. "No," Layla replied, "but he's watching us. We should leave," Juno said. Kai shook his head. "Too risky. Not in the dark. We wait until morning. If he doesn't move, maybe he'll go." Layla wasn't sure. She sat near the door, pipe beside her, staring out the cracked glass. She didn't blink, didn't move, not until the first light of day spilled over the rooftops. When it did, the man was gone. The mood in the house changed after that. Every creak became suspicious. Every knock of wind on the wall made hearts race. Even Mira, who'd started to speak more freely, went quiet again. Kai tried to lift their spirits, telling stories, playing guessing games with the kids, but even he couldn't shake the tension. That night, Layla found a note under a brick near the fence. It wasn't paper. It was carved into a piece of wood, like someone had taken a knife and scratched each word slowly. "Not all shadows are enemies. Some just want their names back." Layla showed it to Kai. His jaw tightened. "What does it mean?" "I think he's watching." Kai looked around. "Still?" She nodded. "I can feel it." Over the next few days, more signs appeared. A blanket folded neatly on the porch one morning. A can of food left by the gate and opened untouched. The broken fence, repaired overnight with new nails and fresh wood. Juno was the first to say it. "What if he's helping us?" Layla didn't know what to believe. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't shown his face. But he hadn't hurt them either. And Layla couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her chest. That somewhere, somehow, she'd seen that shadow before. That maybe the stranger with no name had once belonged to a world that included her. That night, she stayed up alone. Just before the moon disappeared, he came again. This time, closer. Not at the fence, but near the porch. Still in shadow, still silent. Layla stood in the doorway, not afraid. Not anymore. She didn't speak. She didn't move. And then he did something unexpected. He nodded, just once. Then he turned and vanished down the street. Layla watched him go, her heart pounding with something she couldn't name. When she went back inside, she sat beside the fireplace and wrote one word in the dust: hope. The house had a secret. Layla found it by accident 2 days after the stranger disappeared again. She was clearing out the upstairs room, one they hadn't dared use yet because of a broken floorboard. But curiosity got the better of her, and maybe, deep down, she was searching for something. Answers, clues, a trace of the man who watched them from the shadows. The sun filtered through a crack in the ceiling, lighting up the dust like falling stars. Layla stepped carefully over the warped floorboards and pushed aside an old dresser. Behind it, carved into the faded wall, were names, hundreds of them, scrawled in childlike handwriting, scratched in with keys, nails, broken glass. Some were full names, some just initials. Some had tiny hearts or stars beside them. Some had dates. And above all of them, in block letters nearly worn away by time, "We were here too." Layla reached out and traced the letters with her fingers. A shiver ran through her. She sat there for a long time, reading the names, whispering them softly like prayers. They were kids, all of them. Kids like her, like Mira, like Kai, forgotten, but not erased. She called the others upstairs. One by one, they stepped into the room, eyes wide, quiet with reverence. Even the youngest stood still. Kai walked slowly to the wall and read the message aloud. "We were here too." Juno looked around. Who wrote them? Other kids, Layla said, from before. Maybe even years ago. Mira touched one of the names. Lena. "Do you think they made it out?" Layla didn't answer. Instead, she pulled a small nail from the floor and carved Layla. Then she stepped aside. One by one, the others followed. Kai, Mira, Eli, Suri, Talia, Juno. And then, as if pulled by something unseen, Kai carved another name beneath his own. Dusty. Layla's breath caught. She didn't speak, but she nodded. When they finished, they stood in silence. They weren't invisible anymore. That night, something changed. The fear of the stranger faded, replaced by something else, a connection. To the house, to the names, to each other. Layla sat by the fire with the group huddled around, watching the flames. "I think he knew about that wall," she said. Kai looked up. "The man?" Layla nodded. "I think he might have written his name there once. Why doesn't he speak? Maybe no one's spoken to him in a long time." Kai considered that, then said, "Maybe he's waiting for someone to remember." As they slept, Layla stayed awake again. And in the middle of the night, she left a small candle burning on the porch. An invitation. Or maybe a thank you. The next morning, the candle was gone. But beside it, imperfect, even letters scratched into a flat stone, was a name. Jonas, nothing else. No explanation. Just a name. Layla picked it up, held it in her hand. Then she walked upstairs, found a space on the wall, and added it to the list. Jonas. We were here too. And now we still are. Jonas. The name echoed in Layla's mind for days. It sat on the wall like it belonged there, like it had always been there. But now it had a face blurred by shadows, wrapped in silence. The man who watched, who left food, who nodded once and vanished. The others asked about him less now. It wasn't fear, it was respect. Whoever Jonas was, he had become part of their story, even if his chapter had been written long before theirs began. But for Layla, the connection went deeper. She remembered Flash's cold nights in back seats, yelling voices, the sound of someone slamming a door. A name whispered once when she was small. Jonas. Had it been him? The following week brought stillness. They fixed more of the house, patched up the upstairs room, cleaned the old shelves, even made a curtain from torn shirts. Mira turned the wall of names into a ritual. Every night, they added a memory with each name. Something small, something real. Lena loved birds, she'd say. Tommy could whistle with his fingers. Dusty chased every car that passed. It became a way to honor the ones who didn't make it, or the ones they'd never meet. It gave them roots in a place that was never supposed to hold them. One night, as Layla sat near the fire, she noticed a draft, not from the doors, from upstairs. She followed the chill up the stairs and into the far end of the hallway. A window, previously painted shut, was slightly ajar. She pushed it open with a creak and found something unexpected. On the ledge sat a small metal box, old and rusted. She pried it open. Inside were scraps of paper, folded tightly, faded with time. She pulled one out carefully and read it. "I didn't steal the food, I swear, but I still got kicked out. If someone finds this, I was just hungry." Her chest tightened. She pulled another. "I miss my sister. I don't even know if she remembers me. I hope she's okay." And another. "I'm scared all the time, but I try to be brave for them. I don't want them to know I cry." Layla read them all, dozens of them. Messages from kids who had stayed in the house. Their secrets, their pain, their truths. This wasn't just a place to sleep. It had always been a place to speak, to whisper into the wind and hope someone would listen. She took the box downstairs and showed the others. They read in silence. Then Juno said, "We should write back." Kai blinked. "To who?" "To them," she said. "To the ones who left the notes. Maybe they're still out there." So they did. Each of them wrote something simple, honest. "You weren't alone. We're here now. Kai, your sister would be proud of you. Talia, you were brave. Braver than most." Layla, they folded the notes, placed them in the box, and put it back on the windowsill. From that day on, they called it the Whisper Window. Anyone who needed to speak, who couldn't say things out loud, left a message there. Some were sad, some hopeful, some just names written over and over again so they wouldn't be forgotten. And every night, Layla checked the box. She never saw who added the new messages, but sometimes there were extra ones, written in a hand none of them recognized, and every single one sighed. Jonas hadn't disappeared. He was still listening. It started with smoke, just a faint curl drifting through the crack in the window, like a warning whispered too late. Layla smelled it first. She was in the upstairs hallway, checking the whisper window when it hit bitter and sharp. Not the soft burn of a fire kept under control, but the wild kind, the hungry kind. "Fire," she gasped, spinning on her heels. She bolted down the stairs. "Fire!" Everyone up now. The others scrambled to their feet. Kai grabbed the emergency pack, a pillowcase stuffed with their only clothes, documents, drawings, memories. Mira clutched her doll. Talia scooped up Ela, who'd barely stirred before panic took over. Smoke thickened fast. The back of the house glowed orange. Out the front, Layla shouted. They ran. Outside, the fire was already roaring. Flames licked the back windows, devouring the rear wall like it had always belonged to the flames. Black smoke coiled upward into the pale dawn sky. The fire crackled, alive and cruel. They stood in the overgrown yard, shivering and watching their sanctuary burn. Juno was crying. Suri held her, silent. Kai cursed under his breath. This wasn't an accident. Layla turned to him, throat dry. "You think?" He nodded grimly. Somebody said it. A chill slid down her spine, colder than the morning air. It took hours for the fire to die. Neighbors didn't come. The house had always been ignored, forgotten. Just another wreck in a city full of them. They waited until the flames died out and the smoke thinned. Then Layla walked back in. The back rooms were gone, ash and blackened beams. But the living room still stood. Half the roof was open to the sky, but the fireplace remained. So did the wall of name, scorched, smudged, but still there. She dropped to her knees and touched the letters. They were warm, alive. Later, they found the matchbox. It was near the fence, half buried under dead leaves. Not theirs, a fresh one. Kai picked it up, turned it over. Used recently. Could have been anyone, but Layla's gut said otherwise. Someone had wanted them gone, not just the kids. The memory of them, the wall, the names, the story. "We're not leaving," she said that night. They huddled in the half-burnt house, cold but determined. The back rooms were gone, but the core remained. Kai looked at her. "We can't sleep here." "Not yet." "I know," Layla said, "but we stay nearby. Watch. Rebuild. If we leave, they win." Mira nodded, fierce. "We fix it." They didn't have much. but they had a place that mattered, a history carved in walls and whispered into windows. Layla stood and faced them all. "We make a plan." The next day, they started collecting bricks, boards, tools from dumpsters, anything. And on the back of a flattened cereal box, Kai drew a new layout for the house, a blueprint. "One room at a time," he said. They worked like builders and slept like survivors under an abandoned billboard nearby, waiting for the house to rise again. And every day, before sleep, Layla returned to the wall of names. She cleaned it with a damp rag, then added a new one, the fire, so they would remember, not just what they lost, but what they chose to rebuild. Rebuilding was slow. Every day after sunrise, they returned to the house, armed with whatever they had gathered: bent nails, wood scraps, torn tarps. Suri found a rusted hammer behind an old mechanic shop. Juno discovered a roll of duct tape still half full. Even Eli pitched in, dragging boards with all the strength his little arms could muster. They didn't talk much while they worked. They didn't need to. The rhythm of rebuilding was its own language: hollow thuds of hammers, the screech of dragging beams, the soft encouragements whispered between gritted teeth. Each day, something rose where there had been nothing. A wall, a corner, a roof patch. It wasn't just construction, it was defiance. On the third day, Layla returned to the whisper window. She wasn't expecting anything new, but there was a note waiting, written on yellowed paper, folded neatly, the ink uneven, as if written by someone with a trembling hand. "I remember this place. I remember hiding here when I had nothing. I remember writing on the wall when I thought I would vanish. And now I see you. You're doing what we couldn't. Don't stop. J." Layla reread it 3 times. She brought it to the group that evening, reading it aloud as they sat on their makeshift blankets, sore and exhausted. No one spoke for a long time. Then Talia whispered, "Do you think he's watching us right now?" "I hope so," Layla said, "because we're not stopping." Later that night, the wind picked up. Cold swept across the yard, whispering through the cracks like a voice trying to find its shape. Layla sat on the porch, wrapped in a coat that didn't fit, eyes on the stars barely visible through the city haze. She spoke into the dark, not a whisper, not a cry, just a steady voice. "If you're out there, Jonas, thank you." She paused. "I don't know who you lost. I don't know what made you stay in the shadows, but your name's on our wall. You're part of this now, and we'll keep building because that's what families do." The wind moved again. This time, it didn't howl. It sighed, like a thank you. By the end of the week, one room was complete. It had 4 walls, a patched roof, and no floor, but it kept the rain out. They called it the core. Everyone took turns sleeping inside it. Mira made a rule: no nightmares allowed inside the core. If you had one, you had to go outside and tell it to the wind. Juno thought it was silly until she tried it. Then she stopped waking up screaming. One night, while the others slept, Layla sat near the fire with Kai. He handed her something small, a nail, but etched into the side, barely visible in the firelight, was a name: Layla. Her breath caught. "Where'd you get this?" "Found it in the rubble," Kai said. "Figured you should have one with your name too." Layla turned it over in her palm. "You think we're going to make it?" she asked. Kai stared at the flickering flames. "We already are, and in the shadows. Just beyond the light, something moved. Not danger, not fear, just presence. A man in a long coat, watching and smiling. The first time someone noticed them, really noticed, it felt like a mistake. Layla was helping Mira paint the side of the house, brush strokes wide and clumsy, but full of color. Bright yellows, deep blues, lines that didn't follow any rules. It was messy. It was beautiful. It was theirs. A woman walked by on the sidewalk, slow, pushing a stroller. She stopped, watched. Layla tensed, ready for a glare or a shake of the head, the usual. But instead, the woman smiled and said, "That color's perfect." Layla blinked. "What?" "The blue," the woman said. "It looks like sky." Then she kept walking. Just like that, Layla stood still for a moment, brush dripping in her hand. Mira looked up. Did she mean it? Layla smiled. "Yeah, I think she did." Word spread slowly. At first, it was just whispers. A few older kids passed by and nodded in respect. A man in a truck left a bundle of scrap wood near the fence and drove off without a word. An old woman brought a bag of food, bread, apples, a single chocolate bar, and left it with a note. For the ones who fight to stay, it wasn't a flood of help, but it was something. And for kids who had spent so long being invisible, that something meant everything. They painted the rest of the house over the next few days. Each wall a different color. The front, yellow like the sun. The back, green like weeds that never gave up. The side, blue like sky. The last wall, the one with the names, remained untouched, preserved behind clear plastic mirror had found in an alley. It was their memory wall, their promise wall. Then came the reporter. She showed up one morning with a camera and a notebook. Her shoes were to clean for the street, and her eyes scanned everything like she was memorizing the details. Layla spotted her from the porch. "Can I help you?" she asked, cautious. The woman smiled, careful. "Name's Amara. I heard about the house. Wanted to see for myself." Layla folded her arms. "Why?" "Because people need to see this. What you're doing. It matters." Kai joined her. "We don't need charity." Amara nodded, not offering it. "Just a chance to tell your story. On your terms." Layla looked at the others through the window. Mira was braiding Suri's hair. Juno was teaching Eli how to spell his name. Talia was painting a flower on the porch rail. She turned back to Amara. "You get one interview. No names unless we give them. No filming the wall." Amara smiled. "Deal." The story aired 3 days later. It wasn't flashy. No pity music, no voices of authority, just images of paint-covered hands, laughter by a fire, a house slowly rising from ash, words written on a wall in shaky handwriting, and one quote from Layla looking straight into the lens. "We're not asking to be saved. We're asking to be seen." After that, everything changed. Not the house, it stayed rough and real. Not the kids, they stayed scarred and strong. But the world noticed. Volunteers brought tools and nails. A teacher dropped off books and pencils. A local carpenter showed up every morning to teach them how to build for real. Someone donated mattresses and food. So much food. One night, as they sat around the fire, Layla looked around. The core was now part of something bigger for rooms. Real walls, shelves with canned goods, a working sink, solar lights flickering like tiny stars. Mira leaned against her shoulder. "We did this," she whispered. "Yeah," Layla replied. "We did." And from the edge of the yard, half hidden by trees, a man in a long coat watched the house glow like a lighthouse in the dark. Jonas didn't come closer. He didn't need to. They'd already become everything he'd once hoped for. Chapter 15. We were here. The night air was warmer than it had been in weeks. Crickets sang in the weeds. The wind moved gently through the cracked boards of the fence, and the city, for once, didn't feel like it was pushing them away. Layla stood alone in the yard, her fingers brushing over the top of the wall that once held scorch marks and now held color layers of handprints, names, and stories sealed in cracked paint. The wall had survived the fire, survived the winter, survived, or maybe it was the other way around. Inside, laughter echoed. Juno was trying to fix the broken shelf again, pretending she knew what she was doing. Mira had convinced Eli to help her paint more stars on the ceiling. Talia had started humming a song no one knew, but everyone listened to. Suri sat by the window with a notebook in her lap, sketching something quietly, like always. The floorboards creaked behind her. Kai stepped into the yard, hands in his pockets, eyes on the stars. "It's quiet for now," Layla said. He nodded. "I like it." They stood in silence, the kind that didn't need filling, the kind that meant something was ending or beginning, maybe both. "The last beam went up today," he said. "Front room's done." Layla looked at him. "Did you think we'd ever finish it?" "No," he admitted. "Not really. But we didn't stop." She let out a breath. "Neither did the city. It tried to take us. Again and again, but it didn't," Kai said. "We're still here." She turned back toward the wall. The names had multiplied, not just theirs anymore. Dozens more. Kids who'd stayed for a night, or a week, or longer. Some had moved on. Some stayed. Some carved names in silence. Others wrote them loud and proud. All of them mattered. We should leave space, she said, for more names, for everything that's still coming. That night, they gathered by the fire. No big celebration, no speeches, just warmth and food and the quiet closeness they'd earned. Mira passed around pieces of bread they'd toasted over the fire. Juno told a ghost story that made Eli hide under a blanket. Suri didn't speak, but when Mira laughed, she smiled. Kai reached into the small wooden box by the fireplace and pulled out the notebook they'd started together months ago. The first page had one word written in Layla's handwriting. Home. He handed her the book. She flipped to the last empty page, looked at all of them, then slowly began to write. She didn't rush. Each letter took its time. When she finished, she passed the notebook to Kai, and he read it aloud, his voice steady, quiet. We were abandoned, forgotten, left behind, but we did not stay broken. We built something, with bruised hands, with borrowed time, with love that didn't ask for anything in return. This house remembers us, and we remember everyone who came before. We are not what the world said we would be. We are more. We are still here. Nobody clapped. Nobody had to. They just sat there, the firelight dancing across their faces, and listened to the wind moving through the trees like it was carrying their words into the city. Later, after the fire dimmed and the others drifted to sleep one by one, Layla walked to the back of the house. The wall stood tall in the darkness. Every name glowed faintly beneath the moonlight. She picked up a piece of chalk from the ground. No hesitation. She knelt and wrote one last name in the corner. Hope. She drew a small circle around it. No heart, no star, just a circle. Complete. Whole. She stood there for a long time, arms crossed over her chest, Dusty's old collar still around her wrist, frayed and faded, but holding strong. And from somewhere beyond the fence, beyond the city's cold heart, she thought she saw movement. A coat, a silhouette, a nod, and then nothing. But Layla didn't need more than that. She turned back to the house, the home they'd rebuilt from ash, pain, and grit, and walked inside without looking back. The door closed gently behind her. The wind carried their names, and the house kept breathing. Then she heard it faint a whimper, not hers. She lifted her head. From behind a trash bin, two trembling eyes peeked out, small, wet, afraid. A puppy. Layla's breath hitched. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, reaching out slowly, careful not to scare it away. The creature took a step back, then paused. Its thin ribs showed through matted fur, and it looked about as broken as she felt. Hey, Layla whispered. It's okay. I won't hurt you. The dog inched forward, sniffed her fingers. Then it licked them. A tear rolled down Layla's cheek. That night, they curled up together beneath the awning of a closed bakery, pressed close for warmth. The rain tapped gently on the tin above them, like a lullaby. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Layla fell asleep with something other than fear beside her. Days passed. The puppy, who she decided to name Dusty, became her shadow, her secret, her only family. She shared every scrap of food she found, whispered her thoughts to him like he could understand. Maybe he could. When she talked, he listened. When she cried, he nuzzled into her chest. Dusty made the silence less loud. They watched the world together from alleyways and broken benches. Layla even smiled sometimes. She began to hum, to laugh in little bursts when Dusty chased pigeons or rolled over for belly rubs. People still passed her by, but it didn't hurt as much with him there. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. They were by an abandoned lot near the edge of the city. Layla had found a piece of stale bread and was breaking it in half to share. Dusty barked once playfully before chasing a fluttering paper bag. Layla giggled. That's when she saw him. A man, tall and thin, with a dark coat that hung too low over his arms. His face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, and his shoes clicked sharply against the wet pavement. He watched her. No smile, no warmth. Come here, Dusty, Layla said quickly, her voice tense. The puppy ran to her. She picked him up, holding him close. The man stepped forward. Layla stood, backing away. I don't have anything, she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. The man didn't answer. She turned to run. A sharp sound cracked the air like fire or thunder or the end of the world. Dusty went limp in her arms. Layla froze. The warmth left her hands. Her ears rang. Her knees gave out as she fell to the ground, still holding him. His eyes were open, but he didn't blink. His body was still, so horribly still. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no, please." The man was gone. Just like that, she screamed, not out loud, but inside. A sound that tore through her chest and stayed there, echoing in every breath. And the sky wept with her. Hope you enjoyed the story. Comment where you're watching from, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel.